Hello and welcome folks, Wizuko here! I'm playing Paper Mario and the Origami King at the moment, and even though I used to have doubts about the new combat system, I actually really like it. The artistic style and cute graphics just really had me all in for it. And there was one place that caught my attention especially, the second world, Shagoon Studios. A level that pays homage to Japanese history and draws heavy inspiration from it. Today, I want to have a look at the historical counterparts that were the inspiration for Shagoon Studios. So join me on a look back on what inspired Paper Mario's Shagoon Studios. But first, how do you get to Shagoon Studios anyway? When you destroyed the first streamer, Mario and Olivia make their way to Autumn Mountain. On their way, they meet Bobby, a Bob who has lost his memories. Due to that, he has nowhere to turn to, so he might as well follow you around for now. Autumn Mountain is set, as the name suggests, in an autumn-themed Asian forest. The red and yellows that create the beautiful view should later be replaced by beautiful yet cold bluish colors. The first boss, a water dragon, wields the power of water, which again Mario and his friends need to refill the river that connects the upper and the lower parts of the mountain. But more importantly, connect the Autumn Mountain tramp with Shagoon Studios. And after a tough fight, the water elemental was defeated by Mario, and Olivia absorbed the power of water. With that power, the river was no obstacle anymore, and an absolute nightmare of a boat ride later,
not gonna make it, I think.
Mario and his friends arrive in Shagoon Studios. There would also be this second streamer that was wrapped around Peach's castle. So there was no way around it. You had to go to an amusement park. Yes, Shagoon Studios is an amusement park, all set up with workers pretending to be from olden times. The studio itself is set to look like a city with houses, shops, and other buildings in the old Japanese style. While Mario and his friends explore Shagoon Studios, they would discover ninjas, a shuriken shop, zen gardens, a petting zoo, and more. After every chest was opened, every toad found, every puzzle solved, and every hole filled, Mario and his friends would finally find a way into the biggest building in the studios, a theater, and a deadly play was about to unravel. But don't you worry, Mario would never give up or lose. He'd find a way to free the toads of Shagoon Studios from the evil rubber band villain. And that's what happened. And believe me, I left some spicy parts out. I suggest to play for yourself to get to see everything. Or you can watch me play the section here on my channel. Now, let's have a look at the inspiration for this level. Starting around 1600 and lasted until the Meiji Restoration in 1868, was the isolated period of Edo. The period is named after Japan's capital of the time, which is today known as Tokyo. Edo, or more likely pronounced Edo, was a very interesting time in Japan's history. During this time, arts and poetry had an all-time high, even though the common people of Japan suffered from food shortages throughout those years. Japan lived isolated during that time. Afraid that the Westerners would colonize Japan, the Bakufu, the government of Japan during Edo times, closed up the whole country. No one was allowed to leave, no one was allowed to enter, aside from this little place where the Dutch were allowed to sell and buy goods. And now, before we get too carried away, how does that connect to Shagoon Studios, and why Edo and no other period? First, because it's in the name. While Shagoon had been a title even way back in the Nara period, Shagoons have never been that important before. in Japan's history. Because while a shogun would always be considered royalty, they didn't really have political power. They were also just obeying orders. Until the Edo period, where the Tokugawa shogunate would change all of that. Now, Japan was united after a long and bloody period of separation under a military government called the Tokugawa shogunate, or sometimes just Bakufu. The new government, under the lead of Tokugawa Ieyasu, would renovate and anew the infrastructure and bureaucracy of Japan in the following years. Well, and second, because Shagoon Studios resembles the build of Edo during that time. In Shagoon Studios, you would enter the park much like you would have entered Edo over a stunning bridge, which in return would lead to alleyways filled with shops and merchants. Edo was one of the biggest and busiest cities of its time after all. Due to the landscape, Edo would have a lot of bridges, which is why bridges are a common motif for Edo illustrations of the time, showing people crossing the glamorous bridges to enter the city of hopes and dreams. The strategic benefits are obvious. The guards inside the city would see enemies miles ahead, which, on the other hand, would have to cross the river or the bridge to even get there. Edo was at a good position, but strategic benefits aside, would those bridges also be known for their aesthetic? The Edo Tokyo Museum has a built-in bridge that would transport the visitors from the entrance area to the main part of the museum, emulating the feeling of Edo. When looked at the realistic scale, Edo must have been a mind-blowing view, for the people back then at least, by the sheer size of it. I mean, here is a model that I have photographed back when I was in Tokyo. Paper Mario tries to copy exactly that, however, in a little smaller scale. The bridge, or rather bridges, in Shagoon Studios are not as impressive as Edo's long bridges were, but still it is recognizable, and in my opinion, it's enough to see the reference to Edo. Furthermore, the houses that you can enter remind of traditional Edo houses. Typical during that time were those little fireplaces in the middle of a room, usually surrounded by sand or stones, so that if the fire was to go out of control, the wooden or tatami flooring wouldn't burn. Also noteworthy is the step that you have to take between the door area and the rest of the house. Now that sounded a little bit abstract. What I mean is this here. This is the old version of an Genkan. That is the traditional Japanese entrance hall. Up to this day in Japan, you would enter a house, take off your shoes, maybe put on your house slippers, and then you would go up the step to enter a Japanese home. It is believed that this tradition originated from the idea that if you would leave your footwear down there, you would carry less filth or dirt inside. And depending on who you're asking, that can be taken with religious hint to it as well. However, I personally found the explanation that the often occurring monsoons, floods, and earthquakes made people build their houses on those stilts to protect themselves. Thus, the Genkan was born. Regardless why they were invented, Paper Mario would represent them accurately as already shown. The main attraction of Shagoon Studios is of course the theater, in which you battle the evil rubber band. And guess what? Yes, theater was a huge deal in Edo too. Not only did the famous Kabuki Theatre originate from this period, it was also the reflection of how important arts were during the Edo period. The Edo Tokyo Museum highlights that with a life-size rebuild of a traditional Kabuki theater and even performing Kabuki. Kabuki, by the way, is a live performance where the actors were immensely overacting with makeup, costume, and their acting itself. It's an art form where music and story is told via abstract dancing, singing, and overacting. Sometimes kabuki wouldn't even use real language, but rather noises that would fit the music. You can see typical kabuki makeup used in Paper Mario in the ninja house, right before you exit. It is definitely fascinating to watch, but ultimately doesn't have too much to do with the several musical parodies Paper Mario presents us with during our stay in Shagoon Studios. So while the performances don't reflect the real Edo, at least the theater does, especially with the many papier-mâché monsters around the theater. It was not uncommon for Edo theaters to organize rather big festivals, where the performers would gather around the streets, giving people a taste of what they'd get at the theater. And I can imagine that must have led to a very unique atmosphere around town. In many old illustrations and poetry, festivals like that are referenced until they would find their way back to influence pop culture, like this little nod in Paper Mario. Besides, the design of the theater in Paper Mario does pay high resemblance to Edo Castle, don't you think? But I know why you're really here. You are probably already wondering, when am I going to address the whole ninja theme going on at Shagoon Studios? And I hear you. I'll get to it now. But before we can talk about ninja, you gotta know a thing about samurai. During the Nara and Heian period, samurai were loyal to whoever was in charge during these times. The code of honor that we nowadays associate with samurais, however, originated in Edo, a lot later than the actual highest time for samurai. So now that the samurai had a moral code that would forbid them to fight in certain ways and forced them to openly carry their battles, who do you think would do the dirty work? Officially, Japan was united and Edo was mostly a very peaceful period. But of course, the royalty would get bored and eventually start beef with each other. So ninjas were regularly used to assassinate, spy on, or intimidate from the shadows. In that sense, the many representations of ninjas in Paper Mario does make sense when you keep in mind that ninjas had their last great appearance in history during Edo. Because 200 years later, when the Edo period ended and the Meiji period started, ninjas were mostly considered rather folklore and myth than reality. And so here it was, the historical influences I found in Shagoon Studios. I hope you guys enjoyed this very experimental and very new format. I'd love to know what you think of it. I tried to keep the information brief and relevant, so I hope it didn't turn out too condensed now. If you have a recommendation for another game I should check out for this series, let me know. New videos are coming every Wednesday, and I hope to see you in the next. Until then, have it good. Bye!